Sue Perry there at the controls to go ahead and begin recorded meeting. I'm Tom Davis with the Municipal Planning Department, and with me today is lead presenter Elizabeth Appleby and also other staff team members on this amendment project, Ms. Sonic Calhoun, Daniel McKenna Foster from the Planning Department. I believe Randy Ribble is going to be here or is here, Traffic Engineering Department. And I see a lot of folks who we have consulted with and worked with on this project entering in right now. So thank you for joining. Elizabeth and I are going to walk you through the highlights of what has changed in this public hearing draft from our previous draft, community discussion draft from last fall. We're open to questions and comments. So we go through. Go ahead and keep your mic on mute if you are not talking or asking a question. If you have a question, you want to make a comment, go ahead and either raise your hand using the Microsoft Teams hand feature. One of our staff members will see you, and or go ahead and type your question in the chat box. Elizabeth will stop at frequent points to go ahead and see if there are questions about a particular topic. Once we're done with the presentation, we'll go through a few example sites where you see what would happen to the parking requirements of these individual residential developments. And then we will spend the balance of time at questions and feedback. We'll post this session and its PowerPoint on the project webpage, and also I'll provide a link to the project webpage as Elizabeth begins to talk here. So Elizabeth, why don't you go ahead and get going on just the presentation of the highlights of public hearing draft and how it's changed.
Yeah, welcome everyone. So I'm going to start out with our schedule and timeline. So we're now in step 3 of the public hearing drafts. So we started with step 1 where we had pre-consultations, where we had feedback and we had an online survey questionnaire, and we got input on policies before we even wrote the code changes. Then the community discussion draft was the initial written draft of the code amendments to Title 21. And then now we're here at step 3, where there's been amendments made to the initial draft. And then there will be a public hearing before the Planning and Zoning Commission on April 11th. And then they will make a recommendation on the code change. And then the Assembly will then decide on the adoption of the code change. Comments, we'd like to have comments ideally by March 21st if possible, because we finalize our staff packet for the Planning and Zoning Commission case around then. However, you can still submit comments all the way up until the day before the meeting. We have a project webpage that we've maintained throughout this project. There are public hearing draft materials on the webpage now. Attachments 2, 3, and 4 are just different ways to look at the code amendments. So we have one that shows the draft assembly ordinance, one that shows the annotated code amendments, and then one that's a clean version that just shows what the final code will look like. I'm just going to navigate to our website really quick and pull that up. And actually, Tom or someone, if you could just copy this and paste it in the chat, just it'll be easier if someone else does it. All right, so here's our project webpage. If you scroll down, these are the public hearing draft materials. Even further, you can look back at other things you've released throughout the project. You can look at some of the feedback we've gotten. The bar on the right shows upcoming events. So eventually we'll add a link to the Planning and Zoning Commission public hearing once it is live. And then as far as the public hearing materials, I'm just going to show attachment 1, the project summary, and attachment 3 really quick. Okay, so attachment 1 is a good high-level overview of all of the code changes. The presentation we're sharing today, we actually pulled some elements from this just to remind everyone of what's happening. There's 6 major proposals, and then this document goes into some detail on each of the proposals and some background on how we ended up getting there. Attachment 3 is the zoning code amendment language. At the start of this document, there's a cross-reference. So each of the 6 proposals has a little header, and then there's subsections. So you can use this to find a topic area you're particularly interested in, and then it will tell you what page the change is on. So the idea is there's a page that shows all of the code changes. So anything that was deleted or added, and then there's a corresponding page. I suppose for here I would go here for page 1. There's a corresponding page that just gives more detail on what change is being made and why it's being made. It's a pretty lengthy document because we showed absolutely every single change to the text of the code. So even if we were just relocating a piece of code, there'll be a page that shows where it's being deleted and then another part showing where it's being added. So that's why we also have the code changes available in the clean version if you just want to see what we're thinking the final code language would look like, in the summary sheet, just to give a good overview of all of the changes. So going back to our PowerPoint today, thank you everyone who's given us feedback and input. I know several of you here today have attended past information sessions or workshops, so thank you. We've met with a lot of people over the course of this project. To the right just shows a snapshot of our online survey and live poll questionnaires. We have had support throughout the project for area-specific minimum parking requirements tailored to urban neighborhoods and transit-supportive development corridors. So thank you for your past and continued input on the project. Again, these are the 6 main proposals, and we're just going to go into a little overview. We're not going to go into extensive detail on each of the 6 proposals so that we have time for the examples, but we just wanted to give a quick reminder of what's being done and then show the changes that have been made from the community discussion draft moving into the public hearing draft. So the first 2 proposals are a bit interrelated. So the idea is we're streamlining approvals for administrative parking reductions and adding a few things to the menu of parking reduction strategies. So someone could get a non-discretionary approval for a parking reduction strategy. They're providing up to a certain %. And so this would prevent having to do a parking study and or getting approval from the planning director and traffic engineering anytime you're asking for any sort of parking reduction. Changes we've made for these 2 proposals in the public hearing draft is we've increased the reduction for bicycle parking. We'll go a little bit into more detail for bicycle parking later in the presentation. We've also simplified the calculation of multiple reductions and made the reduction for unbundled parking available to non-residential uses. And then from all of the proposed code amendments for this project, we've removed anything that would amend ADUs, which are accessory dwelling units. That's being addressed in a separate project that is currently underway. It's just in its beginning stages. Daniel McKenna Foster is the planner who's heading up that one, if you'd like to follow up with him on the ADU project. The third proposal is for area-specific lower parking requirements. So a reminder that in current code, there are areas of the municipality where you can get an administrative parking reduction. We're proposing instead just to offer a lowered minimum parking generally within those same areas. Changes we've made in the public hearing draft is we've more clearly denoted that these changes are only for the neighborhood context areas we've identified, and the current area where there's an exemption in the downtown districts for parking, where there's no minimum parking, we're just leaving that the same. We're not touching it. And then we also clarified the descriptions for the neighborhood context areas, which again are traditional urban, edge urban, and transit supportive. And the idea is, in general, traditional urban tends to be closer to downtown, and we're offering a larger percentage lowering in the minimum parking requirement in the traditional urban areas compared to the transit supportive areas, because we think that accurately reflects the development that's there currently and the goals for those areas, and also current patterns and future patterns of car ownership and transit ridership and such. We have 2 slides actually for the third proposal. I'm going to throw it back to Tom to go over this one.
So like Elizabeth said, there are certain parts of Anchorage in Fairview and South Addition, and then some of the edge urban neighborhoods and transit corridors like along Spenard, parts of East Anchorage, where the minimum by right parking requirement is going to be lower, according to the public hearing draft, lower than the rest of town. This public hearing draft amendment, like the previous draft, also includes a kind of enabling ordinance for areas where groups of property owners or a neighborhood or the municipality could propose a delineated area where there are no minimum parking requirements. In addition to downtown Anchorage, an area where the property owners, individual property owners or developers on individual sites would themselves determine if or how much parking, off-street parking to require. That self-determination is the reason why we're referring to it as the open option parking district idea. So this is an enabling ordinance. And in that area, there wouldn't be minimum parking requirements. In the public hearing draft, we've clarified the approval process and approval criteria for how to create an open option district. And we've also lowered the bar to some degree on how to get approval. What are the steps and hoops to getting approval? We've also clarified some of the prerequisite criteria for creating an open option parking district, primarily having to do with how the municipality, how the community, how well it manages and enforces on-street parking, and how it coordinates the management of on-street parking with street maintenance and other street operations, garbage removal, and the like. So this enabling ordinance has been strengthened in the public hearing draft for the concept of an open option parking district. But this ordinance itself does not itself create or delineate any open option parking districts. That would be a next step. So go ahead, Elizabeth, take us on to the next topic.
All right, so the fourth proposal is improved site access for pedestrians, rideshare, and public transit. We have 2 slides covering this proposal. This slide goes over some of the pedestrian frontage standards changes. So those are things like street-facing windows, covered entry, other things that make for a pleasant and convenient pedestrian experience. We haven't made too many major changes in this proposal in the public hearing draft. The biggest overall proposed code amendment for this section is on the right-hand side, where we've taken all these pages of pedestrian accessibility and orientation regulations, and we've consolidated them into one table that we think will be much easier to reference. Then the second slide for this fourth proposal covers bicycle parking. We did make some changes in the public hearing draft. Many of these changes are rooted in public comments. We heard from Bike Anchorage, and also some of the community councils commented on the bicycle parking. So a reminder of the proposed code amendments is we've now rooted the bicycle parking requirement based on the forecast bike utilization by use instead of tying it to a percentage of the motor vehicle parking that is required for the use. We've increased the bicycle parking requirement primarily in urban neighborhood contexts where there's already a good infrastructure to support some bicycling in those areas. And also where motor vehicle parking requirements have been reduced. And we've added a requirement for long-term spaces for some of the bicycle parking spaces. So that would mean for new construction, some of the bicycle parking spaces would have to be in sheltered, secure spaces. So changes we've made are based on comments. We've adjusted the bicycle parking dimensions to accommodate larger bikes like fat tire and electric bicycles. But then we also created some exceptions from the dimensions for some configurations that don't need as much space. So for instance, a wall-mounted rack where you could still get your bike in and out without hitting another bike without using up as much space. We've clarified where long-term bike spaces could be located. We did add where they could be added to dwelling units if they meet certain requirements. And then we've also added diagrams to better illustrate the dimensional standards and exceptions for bike spaces. Then the last two, I'm going to throw back to Tom.
These are the last two of the 6 main proposals in this ordinance. And as with previous drafts, these have to do with reforming the regulations regarding the dimensions of access driveways onto the property, into your parking areas. And then secondly, reforms to the minimum requirements for the dimensions of parking spaces. A lot of the area taken up by parking really has to do with the driveway and circulation requirements. And so we took a careful look at this section. And as before, this draft focuses on first just simply better organizing and clarifying what the development standards are. So rather than going into residential design standards and the parking standards to determine your residential driveway access requirements, those would be consolidated into one section. The draft proposal includes allowing multifamily developments, for example, a 3 or 4 plex, to have back out parking. In other words, not having to have on-site turnaround space built into the site plan for parking spaces. Where you have only 1 or 2 parking spaces, kind of like a single family or 2-family home, you just basically just have a back out driveway into the local street. And that could save a lot of space. For developments, including multifamily, where the driveway access is serving 10 or fewer parking spaces, such as a typical 3, 4 plex, maybe up to 5 or 6 plex in some cases, to reduce the minimum access driveway width requirement, a 2-way access driveway, down to 1 lane, basically 12 feet, just based on the lack of traffic volume. We believe this can also save a lot of space. Currently, Title 21 has a requirement that there be alley access, that driveway access onto the property receive its access from the rear alley. This currently applies all over the municipality, all over Anchorage and Chigakigo River, where there is an alley. What this amendment proposes, it continues to propose from the previous draft, is to focus the applicability of that requirement only on our proposed mapped urban neighborhood context, the traditional urban neighborhood, edge urban neighborhoods, the mapped area that Elizabeth covered, and to no longer require that in outlying more suburban areas of the municipality. Some other minor changes, well, not so minor in some cases, shown there on the left, including simplifying our parking space dimensional requirements and allowing more non-discretionary review of smaller parking space sizes for residential uses. Some changes in the public hearing draft. Based on some expert consultations, we've removed what in the previous draft was a proposed minimum spacing requirement between rows of facing garage doors. Found that that was unnecessary, and it seemed to be adding more development standards that were all covered where they needed to be in Title 21. So we removed that based on feedback from developers in a design consultation. We have also proposed in the public hearing draft to allow all parking spaces in the traditional urban neighborhood context of Fairview, South Addition, Mountain View, and Government Hill, all parking spaces to be the smaller parking space size of 8.5 feet wide, I think about 18 feet long. Just simply to reflect that those areas were originally built out before we even had our modern, full-size 9-foot wide space requirements. So emphasizing the ability to redevelop in those areas. So those are some highlights from how we are recommending to not only right size our parking minimums, but to attempt to avoid requiring more space and pavement than is really necessary to support the parking utilization. So those are the 5 top main areas of this proposed amendment. Elizabeth covered the first 4, and these are the last 2. And like Elizabeth covered, when she showed you the project web page and how to get to attachment 3, the annotated zoning code amendment attachment, in the beginning of that document, she showed you a cross-reference table. And that is organized by these same 6 main proposals. And so you can go to that cross-reference table, and there she's showing it. And those same 6 proposals are there, and you can dive into the specific kinds of code amendments that we've covered today and find the specific page number and section number, or you can, dive into the specifics of each area that interests you without having to search for it in an 8-page document. So that's those are the 6 highlights and how they've changed. Attempt to explain it in brief. So we're breathless here. We've thrown some information at you, and I don't see hands up. Let me check the chat here. Are there comments so far? Not yet. We are watching for those, and now is the time to ask a question, including if you happen to be dialed in and you can't actually raise your hand in Teams or type something into the chat. Does anyone have any questions so far before we dive into a few project examples? Any clarifications that I think should be made? So, wow, perfect presentation again. Okay. Well, why don't we just go ahead and watch for those hands, and if you have a comment or question in the chat, please throw it in there. This is intended for you to inform, and we will post this project presentation on the project webpage. I think we threw the link in there. Okay, so Andre is telling us to move into those project examples. So Elizabeth, can you go ahead and move us to the next slide? So we have about 5 examples here, and won't belabor them. You'll have access to them. The first 2 slides cover site number 1. This is actually a development from the 2000s, but it's an example of in Fairview, a pair of townhomes, a townhouse style multifamily development on a site. Each building has 4 units side by side, so it's a townhouse style multifamily development with multiple, about 8 dwelling units on a site. Under current Title 21, if that had been built today under current code, essentially would allow about require at a minimum 13 parking spaces. And that applies throughout the bowl. Under the public hearing draft amendments that we're proposing, as Elizabeth said, we are recommending to create, to convert some area-specific administrative parking reductions into by right lower parking requirements for certain areas, including this one. So in this area, the by right parking requirement is actually 30% lower than the area-wide parking requirements. So under this draft, you would have a 9-space parking requirement for these 8 units in Fairview. If you go to the next slide, we'll talk about parking reductions. Now, today you can request a parking reduction, and you would it would be a discretionary review, which involves a discretionary approval review by traffic engineer and the planning director, and might involve a parking study. Under this scenario, a non-discretionary parking reduction is allowed, and so the applicant is selected to provide 4 additional bike parking spaces for this development. And without having to do a parking study or get a discretionary review, they meet the standard, and the applicant knows that they will receive a certain parking reduction, which in this case turns out to be about 1 parking space. So basically, through a non-discretionary review, by right parking requirement, and a non-discretionary approved parking reduction, you essentially have 8 parking spaces required, or 1 per unit, 1 per 2-bedroom townhouse unit. The bike parking requirements would increase under this draft. It is in Fairview. It is in an area where we're recommended a lower parking requirement. So the baseline bike parking requirement would be about 4 bike spaces. And so with this particular reduction that the applicant has selected, you have a total of 8 bike spaces required. Let's go to the next example. So this is the return of the fourplex, a recent fourplex development on a site at Spenard that we've visited. And so we're attempting to imagine what this draft development requirements would do in this case. So once again, under current Title 21 and under our proposal, you have an area-wide parking requirement of 7 spaces that would apply to this 4-unit fourplex, 2 units on the bottom, 2 units on the top floor. And they're 2-bedroom units, so you end up with 1.5 spaces required per unit plus a guest space requirement. So you end up with a 7-space requirement. In this area, this happens to be in the edge urban area. It's not in Fairview, it's in Spenard, it's in that green area on the map. And so there would be a by right lower parking requirement, about 20% lower than the suburban parts of town. And so the by right parking requirement for this wouldn't be 7 spaces, actually you'd round it up to 6 spaces, 5.6 spaces rounded up to 6 parking spaces, the by right parking requirement. The next slide shows a small picture of the alley side of this development. If you squint at it, see even the existing development actually asked for and received a okay, have a comment in the chat for those of you who are watching. I'm sorry?
You can address the question later. I just wanted to get it out there.
Okay, thank you. We will get to that. So the actual development did ask for parking reductions. I'm not exactly sure what they were, but and did get a reduction down to, I think, 6 spaces. But in this case, they have a by right parking requirement of 6 spaces. In our scenario, we went further. The applicant, we pretend that the applicant asks for by right, quote unquote, non-discretionary parking reductions for again, like the previous development, adding some bike spaces. And in our scenario, we also decided to call this all the units affordable rental housing, and for the applicant to document this is these will be affordable HUD rents, and just in our imagining what would happen. So if all the units were affordable and a bit of extra bike parking provided by the applicant, they would have a non-discretionary parking reduction down to 3 parking spaces for this fourplex. A bit more parking spaces for bikes required. So right, so question about the calculation. So first of all, the calculation instructions in Title 21 are proposed to be simplified. So today, some applicants might struggle a bit with how do I calculate how much parking reduction reduces my parking requirement? How do I, add up multiple requested parking reductions? So the draft amendments, and you'll see where in that cross-reference table we keep promoting, you'll see where really propose to simplify those instructions. Furthermore, we're proposing to provide a sort of a cheat sheet, supplementary how-to handout to post on the web that would actually be kind of work like an app that would allow folks to quickly add up what their parking reductions would add up to for their parking requirement. And that includes one for shared parking. So we're proposing to allow up to 3 uses to share parking without having to do a discretionary review. And so Randy Ribble is helping us refine one that he already provides to applicants for calculating shared parking reductions. And we have Elizabeth has her hand raised.
Yeah. Hang on, just putting my mic closer. I think Carly was asking potentially not just where the proposed changes are in code that we're suggesting, but just who internally at the Muni would be reviewing the parking requirements. And I said I didn't think that would change too much. I thought it would still be traffic engineering. I thought land use review and planning may look at them for site plans. Do you have anything else to add on that point, Tom? Just our internal implementation or who people would talk to?
I can cover that as well. So for the non-discretionary parking reductions, the ones where don't require the discretionary review and parking study, those would actually be calculated, on the reviewer side of the counter by the planning department. And so those parking reductions would probably be calculated by the planning department. So. And so that's a good question, and so maybe we'll get into further detail on that, maybe in the staff report and mark that down. So I'm not sure that we've had a powwow about that, but I think the main message is that the calculation become easier, and there'll be more tools to do that. Why don't we go to the third site? Just threw in a non-residential site just to demonstrate that also in the edge urban neighborhood context, that along the transit supported development corridors, that we are also recommending that other uses also have a lower by right parking requirement. And so you see, for example, this medical office building in Lake Otis in the edge urban neighborhood mapped area would have a parking requirements lowered by about 8 spaces. These cost savings are totally back of the napkin, by the way. We're at order of magnitude. Slightly higher. Actually, the bike parking space requirement actually in this case didn't really change much from current code. Let's go to the next slide. Same site. They also, in our scenario, want to have fewer parking spaces. So they received a couple of non-discretionary parking reductions. Got a little bit lower parking requirement. So moving right along to site number 4. Site number 4 is a 3-story multifamily development on a lot. So it's just straight up multifamily apartments, wood frame construction. And would you go back a slide, Elizabeth? I think we're missing the first slide on this development. Yes, there we are. So under current code, oh, there we go. Nope. Okay. So under current code, oh, no. You see the parking requirement, 25 spaces, and this development happens to be 20 units. And apologies to Cook Inlet Housing, I just guessed at what the unit breakout was. So I guessed that it was 14 multifamily, 1-bedroom or studio units, and then 6 2-bedroom units, and came out to a parking requirement of 25 spaces. It's current code. Under the draft code amendments, again, this is once again in an edge urban neighborhood context. The by right parking requirement is a little lower. It would be 20 spaces. So 20 parking spaces for 20 units. I think that in real life, this development asked for a parking reduction and received one to about 23 spaces. But let's go to the next slide. In this scenario, the applicant pushes the envelope and requests a couple of non-discretionary parking reductions. I think I really like those bike parking spaces. I keep throwing those out there. You know, in this case, this development may actually also be eligible, for example, for enhanced building entry, sheltering area, possibly also street-facing building. This building is, you know, has a nice frontage along 32nd Avenue. So under our proposed amendments, there are also parking reductions available for doing that type of, doing what they already did. And so there are other options. In this scenario, we also decided to take it further and suggest that the applicant decides to request a parking reduction for 10 affordable housing units. So what would happen then? So under this scenario, the applicant receives a reduction of 5 parking spaces, and it is only required to have 15 parking spaces. So you can see where the applicant applies strategies that are known to reduce parking demand, parking utilization really, such as affordable rental housing, creating a very pedestrian-friendly development. Ideas we haven't covered in this show would be, you know, unbundling parking from apartment rent for employment uses, for strategies like rideshare. The applicant is getting recognition that the parking utilization level is forecast or targeted to be lower at some point in the future, in the early years of the building's lifespan. If this development were to go whole hog and try to get affordable rental housing reduction, parking reduction for all 20 units, you can imagine the parking requirement getting down to 10 spaces. Then you can begin to connect to other amendments in this public hearing draft, such as parking lots with 10 or fewer parking spaces being allowed to have their two-way access driveway being reduced from 24 feet to 12 feet, or however wide it takes to back the garbage truck out of the parking lot when it's trying to get back off the site, like in this picture. So you can see a cascading effect of some of these reductions. So let's just move along to the very last site here before I cut you all loose. Let's see here. And do we have someone who has their hand raised?
Nope, I don't think so.
Okay, thanks. So in this development, this is based on a parking variance that went before a board of commission a few years ago. Our planners will recognize it. Just before the pandemic began, property owner received a parking variance for redeveloping the former Lamex restaurant, a reuse with an expansion of the building to a kind of a food hall with multiple vendors, kind of like a multi-vendor restaurant scenario with some food processing involved to make the food. And so as part of that, under current code, they went through a parking variance because they needed to, in their case, reduce their parking requirement by 37 spaces. See if they can reduce their parking requirement through our amendment. So in this case, and I've generalized a few things here, that the square footages are not up to par here, but they're generally correct. So under current Title 21, this kind of development would require 146 spaces if it were built new. In this case, we have an example of what will probably be in Anchorage an increasing number of developments, which are reuse or redevelopment of existing buildings. So our land use review section came into play here, and they determined that I think in real life it was 28 spaces, but in this scenario it's 26 spaces were exempted out because the original parking requirement for the restaurant building when it was built was 26 spaces less than current Title 21. And so they got non-conforming rights reduction of 26 spaces. So under current Title 21, in this scenario, that would be about, end up with a parking requirement about 126 spaces. But in our scenario, once again, we have, you see the cactus there on the map. It's in an edge urban area, so the by right parking requirement is lower to begin with. That's 132 parking spaces. And so with that non-conforming rights reduction, we would end up with a parking requirement of 106 spaces. So at the very bottom of the slide, you're 14 spaces down. Like they wanted 37 spaces in real life. We're 14 spaces reduced. So what can they do under a draft to get a further reduction? Let's see what they can do with the non-discretionary parking reductions. Next slide. So we decided to test drive the car to the limit here and just go crazy on the parking reductions and see what happens if we try to just push this draft to the limit. Well, not to the limit, but we did 4 parking reductions, non-discretionary, that might apply to this development. First of all, the bike parking. So our applicant in this scenario proposes to provide 12 extra bike parking spaces. That's not 12 racks, it's actually 6 bike racks, each rack, handling 2 bikes, but is that right? Yeah. 6 bike racks, maybe they put 3 in the front, 3 in the back of the building. So they get a reduction of 3 parking spaces from that. Complete street sidewalk. They benefit from the Spenard Road project. So they actually have a complete streets sidewalk, which is a very enhanced style of sidewalks. I think in a parking reduction, or excuse me, in this parking amendment, we're not calling it that. We're calling it an enhanced street sidewalk. Sorry about that. So they get a reduction for the great sidewalk environment they're a part of. We decided this applicant's going to have a parking cash out program. So this is the only example of one of our many parking reductions strategies available both in current code and under this amendment, where a developer basically, or property owner basically allows the tenants or the employees to get essentially cash back if they don't park. They agree not to park on the site, they get to the site by other means. In the residential side of things, we call it unbundled parking. Some residential apartment owners in town already apply this, where basically you get charged for your second parking space, and if you're a tenant, you don't have a parking. In this case, if employees don't park, there's a program by which the employees get cash back. So that gives them a pretty large reduction, an additional 13 spaces. And lastly, the Anchorage 2040 land use plan calls for the city to begin to create what we call an adaptive reuse ordinance. In this amendment, we're touching a bit, we're starting to get into that idea where adaptive reuse of old buildings that were constructed before our modern parking requirements, i.e. before 1978, that were constructed on these small lots and weren't required to provide more parking, they're given a bit of a break when there's a reuse or addition. This adaptive reuse strategy is being used in cities like Phoenix, Chandler, the suburbs of Phoenix, Arizona, and other areas, where the applicant gets a bit of a break on some of the parking spaces that would be required when they go in and expand that building. Because the building's on this older lot in this older area, and there just simply isn't space. And so in this case, in the example, I see a hand up. There are some instructions on how this works in the draft code, but basically in this example, they get a further reduction of 5 spaces. So total reduction about 24 spaces from the reductions when added to the, I don't know whether it was 12 or 14 spaces of just lower parking requirements. You do end up with about a 30 to 38 parking space reduction total through a combination of a lower area specific parking requirement and these parking reductions if you push it in this case. So in this case, you would end up with 82 parking spaces required at the end of the day. Whereas under current code, I think what were we around 120 or 140 something. No parking variance, no board. And that is the story of the LawMex. We intend to also develop in a couple of the compact Anchorage, Fairview sites, the Fairview Compact Parking, Fairview Compact Design Competition for infill housing that Fairview and Rasmussen and the museum and Cook Inlet Housing put on in 2018. We intend to do that. We just didn't get to it for today. And so Carly has her hand up. Sorry, Carly, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. My question was just on the cash out parking reduction. 2 kind of points of that. One, how do we ensure that the developer is not just putting those costs back towards their development costs? And the question of the cash out value is allowed to be up to 1 year in duration. So do they only get that? Does the employee only get that incentive for 1 year?
Yeah, those are great questions. And you know,
any of this?
That's right. So say, Elizabeth, would you take us back to slide 6? So excellent question. So parking cash out is like a lot of our parking reduction strategies, what we call programmatic. It's not physical. It's not based on, you know, putting down an extra bike rack that's cemented to the ground that's just going to stay there. A lot of them are programmatic. You can't see them, you can't feel them. And so what is it, a handshake or a promise that they're going to continue to provide rideshare through the years? They're going to continue to provide HUD affordable rents, or in this case, parking pricing strategies like unbundled parking or parking cash out. So a lot of these programmatic parking reductions are existing parking reductions that we have in code today. Some of them are new, and what one of our tasks to do is to clarify what type of information the applicant needs to provide for the initial development review and approval. And then secondly, clarifying what would they have to provide periodically over time to demonstrate, you know, I'm continuing, yes, I'm still supporting this rideshare program.
park or traffic engineering to be the keepers,
So
executors?
we believe that it would continue to be like the planning department land use review. And so that is an area where we are admittedly still researching exactly
Okay.
what
Because
that
right
piece
now,
of
if they
paper is
wanted
going
a
to be.
parking reduction, it would go through traffic engineering. But now we're saying, oh, well, the ones that don't really have like a site plan implication, such as like the bicycle parking, we are now the keepers of that.
You know, someone from land use, correct me if I'm wrong, but we are currently in planning through land use review, the, the section that
We do
The-
parking agreements, such as
That's right.
shared parking and shared access, but if it's a parking reduction, I believe it's the traffic director.
No, we also maintain those. Once they've been approved by traffic initially, land use review maintains those records and
Okay,
administers the agreements.
Yeah, so there wouldn't be a change or really a difference in the who is keeping the record. We'd still have the recorded parking agreement, and the the documentation would still be as part of that agreement. For we don't anticipate much difference, but we do anticipate or desire to have more participation. So we do intend to provide a clarified, clarified application, if you will, of what is a developer, what do I need to provide to demonstrate demonstrate that I'm providing parking cash out program or ride share. And Elizabeth has her hand up.
Yeah, I just I saw in the comment there was it seems this would increase the government burden of oversight. I'm not sure that it would for this one, because the idea is you don't have to go through this arduous process if you're asking for a reduction to a certain percent. I suppose internally the piece that we're probably gonna have to make sure we have carefully worked out is, so right now this map here shows where you can get a parking reduction, and it's this patchwork area. It's described in terms of the characteristics of the properties mostly, whereas this is just a more set geography, so it's more clear where we're encouraging lower parking in the municipality.
Allowing
Yeah, or allowing.
by right. Without a
Yeah,
parking
I mean,
reduction.
someone could provide more spaces always, but anyway, we're allowing lower parking. This is just what we have to make sure, I think, is clear and readily available so that we can easily pull up these maps. But I think other than that piece, like, this is actually reducing the administrative burden. A lot of this is more consolidating so that it's easier to use. I suppose the bike parking, that's a new requirement, but I don't think it would be evaluated in a new way. It would just be the traffic would
Actually, that's
just,
an existing parking requirement, and it's being changed.
That's true, because there are already minimum bicycle parking requirements already.
it kind of seems like there might be more oversight in the form of planning, land use review, traffic engineering, because we still have to quantify how some of these like idealistic parking reductions are met, such as the cash out, ensuring that people are doing what they say they're doing. Because those are not just by right, correct? Because Tom said that we needed to still figure out the parameters for those.
Yeah, typically a parking reduction will take several hours of staff time and a number of hours in the private sector side to the private sector proposes a parking reduction. Often the staff side will negotiate with them. Sometimes the parking reduction proposed is the same as the one that comes out that's approved. And so what we're eliminating in most of these cases with non-discretionary parking reductions is just that uncertainty, that cost to the municipality and the applicant. And then the recorded parking agreement will have less content required for it within it for the non-discretionary parking agreements. If applicants do want to have a deeper reduction or get a reduction for a strategy that's not posted here, the non-discretionary parking reduction process is still available. And so that would still require, that what we require today, the review by the traffic engineer and the, in some cases, a parking study. I'm not sure I answered your question or comment.
There's been a few others added, so.
Okay. But it is the management of the changes. Yeah, and another thing we are doing, you will see in terms of the timing of the proposed effective date of this kind of ordinance, we are proposing 60 days after the adoption. Let's say the assembly adopts this ordinance and they adopt it in, I don't know, June or July. If that were to happen, it would be another 60 days before it becomes effective. But we do intend to have some of these administrative paperwork questions answered well before that. A lot of cities do this. Some cities have replaced their parking requirements with requirements to instead do things like unbundled parking. And so we are currently investigating, what's their process and how can we improve our process. With the goal of being to minimize whatever, problems with management there might be.
I'll just note it's 11:58, so we have 2 minutes left in our scheduled time. Tom and I can stay a little bit after to answer additional questions. Are there still, I guess there are questions in the last 2 minutes that anyone wants to ask, or anything in the chat we feel like we haven't touched upon, or any even just general comments about the proposed changes? I'm gonna just flip back to our timeline.
For those who have missed today, or no, none of you have missed today, but if you know someone who's missing today, we also have a repeat session this evening at 6:30 p.m. We are also scheduling a work session with the Planning and Zoning Commission, an introductory work session on Monday the 14th, which I think is next Monday. We'll have more in-depth work session with Planning and Zoning Commission in the night of the hearing at 5:30 p.m. on April 11th, just before the public hearing. So in the meantime, Elizabeth and I are available if your organization need a consultation meeting about areas of concern or interest. Please give us a call. We are interested in that and appreciate everyone's time today. If you want to see more information about this, let us know. We will post this show on the project webpage with the slides. So appreciate everyone's time. If anyone has any questions or would like to stay a little bit longer, Promise not to show more slideshow. Yeah, I don't know if Carly's still with us, but you know, there are a couple cities that post a lot of information about their you know, their applications, like, you know, how do you demonstrate that you're unbundling parking fees as an applicant? And so we've begun looking at those. Might take some phone calls. You know, I think in a lot of cases it might just be, you know, an affidavit of sorts where, you know, someone signs a piece of paper and says, you know, I'm still providing this program, or I'm going to provide this program, that they, you know, they sign it, and that's maybe all we need. So for example, the HUD affordable housing. So we don't have staff having to go through and confirm the applicant's rent rates and compare that to HUD rent rates. It's just that the applicant is just providing a piece of paper saying, yes, you know, I'm providing this, and that may be an easy way for us to administer this parking reduction program. And it's not that we don't have this issue today. We have these parking reductions today, but of course, through these non-discretionary reductions, we're looking at hopefully potentially having a lot more people, developers, partake of it. And so, and can Sonnet, so go ahead, Sonnet. I think there's only about 9 of us left, so.
Yeah, just a couple of thoughts. One thing is that, you know, generally speaking, this won't change the administration of parking reductions or agreements much, other than to, you know, reduce the time taken for approvals, especially with the non-discretionary reviews. There's a lot of those non-discretionary reviews. I think maybe where some of the confusion came in with these unbundled, not unbundled, but the parking pricing strategies is going to be the maintenance. And I have a couple of thoughts. If there was a requirement for ongoing, you know, proof of participation, it could be something similar to our, you know, our B&B admin permits that are renewed yearly. However, if the initial agreement is adequate to obtain the reduction, then I don't know that it would ever become an issue unless there were a parking problem. And at that point in time, if there became a parking problem with a lot of spillover, a lot of, you know, parking issues, that's when we see historically that code enforcement gets called in, at which point code enforcement would, you know, refer back to the original agreement and verify whether the parking pricing strategy was still in place or not. And at that point, it would have to get resolved. So I can see this kind of two ways. Either way, I think, you know, allowing the strategies is a good plan. Figuring out how to administer them, you know, could be as simple as, like you said, just the initial agreement, or perhaps an annual or semi-annual, you know, update of some type of administrative permit. Just a couple thoughts I had listening.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so we sort of we have a renewal on administrative land use permits for B&Bs today, a few other uses. And I think that just involves the applicant providing documentation to the.
Yeah, we actually send out a reminder letter to everyone who has a B&B permit. That's annual, that happens. And then the B&B owners send in their new, you know, renewed business license and renewal application. We make it as easy as possible for them. Lately, Laura Jo's even gone so far as to fill out the applications for them, except the signatures. So.
And I'm sorry, Sonnet, what do they send in again?
They have to send in their new business license, and there's a certification of life safety requirements that goes along with that, and the renewal application, and then there's a fee. There's an annual administrative fee for that. And it's either annual or biannual at the choice of the applicant.
Well, yeah, that's interesting. Our goal would be to make this as simple as possible with little or no cost as possible. but
Agreed. Which
I
is
thought
why,
that this issue is a really good one for Carly to have raised to figure this out now.
yeah, it's something we've kind of touched on a little bit and then said we'll figure it out. But again, as simple as possible would be, letting the applicant provide initial documentation of their program and then just letting the use kind of speak for itself.
That's right.
If
That'd be the
if it
simplest.
becomes a problem later, then it gets addressed at the time it becomes a problem.
Exactly. So if the parking isn't an issue, then there isn't necessarily a need for us to watch very carefully.
Right. Then the strategy is working. If the parking's not a problem, the strategy is working.
It was also interesting to talk about who administers what, and I know there's some complication in there regarding what may be occurring or what may have already occurred with respect to how we reorganize the way that departments are reviewing application developments already to traffic engineering and planning. And I'm not sure if that plays into this. I we'll I guess talk it over more with current planning, but I believe that I think the planning department would play a larger role in administering the by right, quote unquote, by right, the non-discretionary approvals, rather than traffic engineering having to get involved.
Yeah,
'Cause
on
there's
a
really nothing to
non-discretionary
review.
approval, traffic engineering shouldn't have to get involved at all.
Yeah.
That could be handled either by zoning plan review, so Tony and Melissa, or over here in land use review, depending on the agreement requirements.
Okay. And when we receive a development application today, we being the municipality, and we go and building permits passed over to planning and traffic engineering. Is it the planning department or traffic engineering that currently confirms the applicant has provided enough parking spaces at all?
So zoning plan review, Tony and Melissa dictate the parking requirements. Once they've said how many parking spaces are required, traffic engineering looks at that number of spaces to make sure that the design requirements are met, the spacing,
Design
the,
requirements, that's right.
et cetera.
Okay, so fortunately I was hopefully not being inaccurate when I responded to Carly that, for the basic parking requirement and non-discretionary parking reduction, basically be planning department that would be administering those.
Yeah, zoning plan review is part of the planning
zoning
department
plan
now.
review. Mhm.
Yeah, they're part of
That's
current
right.
planning, so.
And land use review would continue to record parking agreements.
Elizabeth's got her hand up.
Oh,
Don't know
sorry,
if you noticed.
Elizabeth.
Yeah, I had talked to Carly a little bit, and she just messaged me directly during the meeting for clarification. So we have this map that's made, and I don't know. She was wondering if it's something that we could add just tied to a tax ID, so it would come up when you pull the property summary report, like not necessarily when you click on it, because none of our other more specific things are there like that, but just there's a tool where you can type in a number and it'll email you a PDF report. We were thinking that, and then some sort of separate interactive map, because that's how like, I don't know, let's just go with someone's earthquake zone. Like to find that out, there's an online interactive GIS map, so you can enter a parcel and then it tells you that, and it shows shading where those zones are. And then if you request this parcel report, that would be part of the information that would be generated in the PDF.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the game plan, Elizabeth. We don't have those interactive maps up and available yet, but
Yeah, which I
yeah,
think is fine because it's
the
not
property
finalized.
summary report, thanks for reminding me what
Yeah,
that
so that
is.
would be,
Yeah.
yeah, that would be something we would do within the 60 days after the ordinance is adopted.
Graham and Craig, are you still listening? Graham, are you from the Bike Anchorage? Are you Graham from Bike Anchorage? He's got his mic off. I'm wondering if he's still with us. Might have forgotten to check out. Craig, I see Craig Bennett. Are you still with us? His mic's off too. I guess these folks apparently forgot to sign out. So, yeah, so that property summary report is very important, I think, and in getting that information. It would almost be to our benefit to somehow get this map converted to a interactive map as quickly as possible. Certainly before we get to the assembly, so that we can demonstrate what this will be like, demonstrate how it will work.
Yeah, I think if we
For
do
the
that, then
assembly hearing.
that solves a lot of these implementation questions, because then if someone in current planning or long range, we get a call from someone looking at a property, we can easily direct them to what their expected parking requirements would be. Then it's clear to Tony and Melissa when they're looking at it. And most everything else would still follow the normal channels for review. I think if we just had the,
Yeah.
I think just that, then, and just reinforcing to staff basically that we're not totally rocking the boat as to how parking is reviewed and how reductions are approved. I think that would work well. So maybe we just need an internal meeting and then just notes on this map.
Yeah. All right. I've got
Overall, great presentation, you guys. Just want to say that.
thanks.
Good job.
Yeah, good job.
Yep.
Elizabeth, that I'm amazed at how quickly you're able to get through everything.
Yeah, you did that really, really well. So
Thanks.
all right, I'm gonna get back to other work. Chat with
All
y'all
right.
later. Okay, bye.
Thank you, Sonnet.
Sounds good. I guess anything else before we close up? I think we're good to close the session.
I think so. I think the sooner we close, the quicker Sue will be able to convert this to a recording. So we'll go ahead and close this meeting and get ready for the evening version.
Okay, sounds good.
Thank you.